I'm Keenan Reesor, and I'm pleased to be in Fort Collins. It's a pleasure to return and perform with the symphony and with Maestro Kenny. I was born not far away in the neighboring state of Utah, in Salt Lake City, and I had parents who, neither of whom were professional musicians, but they both loved music, and my mother taught us me and my siblings how to play the piano. And I still remember my first piece. It was in the Bastion series, big bass drum. I remember the picture of the character on the page, and she pulled me up on the bench when I was 4 and taught me how to play. And at first I liked any musical instrument I could get my hands on. We tried the flute, we did the violin for a year. Piano was kind of all along. And about the time I was 11 or 12, I really just fell in love with the piano literature, with the music of Chopin, well, basically romantic music, first of all. And so was just reading Chopin nocturnes, the etudes, the mazurkas, this Rachmaninoff preludes, Schumann concerto, along with the steady stream of classical piano sonatas, from my teacher and whatnot. And so that was how I got into music really seriously and became quite passionate. About that time, we found a teacher at the local university that I began to study with, and eventually I found my way into the studio of the man who was really probably my most formative teacher, at least one of my 2 most formative teachers. That's Gary Amano, who has taught at Utah State for, I think something like 35 years now, but started to study with him as a teenager, and he's a very gifted teacher, especially in his ability to connect with teenagers, and he was very motivating for me at a pivotal point in my life. And then I ended up entering college a little bit early. There's an element of family tragedy involved there. My mother passed away from cancer when I was 16. I was in between my sophomore and junior years of high school, and the family kind of went in different directions, and I was didn't really want to move and enter a new high school. I never did care for high school that much to begin with, so it seemed like a great opportunity. My teacher invited me to come up to Utah State, so I did. I took a local ACT test and just went up there. You got a release from high school. I started at 17 up there, and had a group of friends that a close group of friends. We got along well, supported each other through our various adolescent wiles, and in the piano department, and so that's where I ended up getting my bachelor's degree, Utah State University. And toward the end of my degree there, I had played in a master class for a visiting artist, Norman Krieger, and ended up going to study with him in graduate school at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. So in the meantime, I had gotten married and to my wife, Noni, who's a violinist, and she gave birth to our first child about 10 days before we moved to LA. We went from the little town of Logan, Utah, college town, and we had both lived in Utah our whole lives, aside from missionary service. And so we went from that little town to the sprawling metropolitan area of Los Angeles, millions and millions of people. So it was a big move, new baby on our hands. But we've been in LA, that was almost 8 years ago that we moved down there, and did a master's degree there in piano. And USC was a great place for me to study because not only do they have outstanding performance faculty, but they have a large and varied academic faculty. And I've always been interested in more musical subjects than just performance. And so by the time I eventually graduated, with the master's degree, started a doctorate in piano there, and and was doing musicology as one of my minors. The way they organize the program there, you have a major, which in my case was performance, and then you choose so many minor areas. And so my major academic minor was musicology. So after a while, after actually about a year and a half into the program, I started to consider a change to musicology for my doctorate, which I did. I subsequently changed, and I'm very glad about the decision, because counterintuitively, it gave me an opportunity to exercise more freedom in my performing activities. So when I made the change, it gave me a little bit more freedom to decide what I was going to play and where I was going to play, because as a family man already, as a graduate student, I didn't the truth of it is that I didn't have enough time to learn all the recital programs that I needed to do for my degree, and at the same time use programs that I already knew to try to get professional experience. And I could see, if I continue going this way, in my circumstances, I'm going to end up with a degree, but without the experience that I really need to break into the profession. And so, again, I want to make it clear that that decision was reflective of my own circumstances, and I certainly wouldn't necessarily discourage anyone from pursuing a doctorate in piano for the reasons that I decided to bow out of that program. But obviously, one does not simply enter a PhD program in musicology just because they want to have freedom in their performing activities. So that would be a complete mischaracterization of the decision in its entirety. Because the truth is that since I was an undergraduate, I have maintained a steady interest in music history, and had assisted the entire sequence as an undergraduate, and had taken music history classes every semester as a graduate student. So it was from the beginning, I was enthusiastic about the opportunity to acquire the skills of the musicological profession. In this case, historical musicology. And thoroughly enjoyed my studies there. And as a matter of fact, I'm just finishing now. In fact, I'm scheduled to defend my dissertation in less than a month. And so it's just been a great journey for me personally. I couldn't have been more supported by the faculty there. And so I've been leading, kind of a double musical life for these last few years, where I have my performing activities, and then I have my research. And so, it's hard to balance two essentially what boils down to two professions, or at least two disciplines, because doing either of them well requires a lot of time. And I certainly find it impossible to do one or the other for any extended period of time in any given day. It's usually I wear one hat one day, musicologist today, I'm a pianist tomorrow, but it's a very rich, I find it to be a very rich way of pursuing my varied musical interests. So that's who I am, I thoroughly enjoy performing, I think for all the reasons that I've ever heard anyone else express in performing life, the chance to basically be an oral historian of music, to an audience that craves that music for its spiritual and intellectual nourishment, and to experience that unique energy, between the performers and the audience in that moment is thrilling. I think that's just the best word I could think of to describe it. It's just absolutely thrilling to be a medium for that mode of communication. So I absolutely love that. And at the same time, there are questions about music, about its nature, and about its history that aren't addressed by performance. That's aesthetic experience and enjoyment. But when you want to answer certain questions about music, you have to look at documents. You need a historical methodology. And so that's been the whole avenue of my research, obviously music history. In musicology then, I'm studying the critical reception of one of the most beloved composers in the concert repertoire, Sergei Rachmaninoff. many people love Rachmaninoff's music, especially the piano concertos and the piano works, and to a lesser degree, but still to a substantial degree, the symphonic works and the songs. But as many people know, there were some critics and scholars in the past who, for various reasons, did not like his music, and so this is what I mean by critical reception, as opposed to maybe popular reception. And so the problem really, he experienced this issue with critics from about the time he emigrated to the West from Russia in the wake of the revolution in 1918. From then until his death in 1943. But the issue was really compounded when one of these musical commentators voiced their strongly, I should say, negative opinion of Rachmaninoff's music in the standard music reference source of probably the entire world, or at least one of a small group of them. This would be Grove's Dictionary of Music and Musicians. And in the 1954 edition of that work, the British lexicographer and music critic Eric Blome really just castigated Rachmaninoff's music in kind of a politely benevolent but really quite overtly dismissive way, Rachmaninoff's music. And this really irked people everywhere that did not share his opinion about Rachmaninoff's music. And because of the prominence of that edition of that dictionary, which was it had 10 reprints over the next 26 years, and so it generated responses from people who had different opinions about Rachmaninoff's music for decades. And I mean, the literature on Rachmaninoff is still dealing with the after effects of this one assessment of Rachmaninoff's music because of the prominent book in which it was published. So in that entry, Eric Blome did mention a few specific items about Rachmaninoff's music that he did not like. He was not, his assessment itself has generated some confusion because he actually cycles through several issues, conceptual issues that contribute to his opinion of Rachmaninoff's music. But he does it in so short a space that you really have to kind of analyze it and even look at his other writings to determine what his views, how his views informed that judgment. And so in his case, he criticized Rachmaninoff for writing in a style that was considered old-fashioned. He said that he didn't have any distinctive national features. You see, Rachmaninoff, as a Russian composer, in the West, Western musical commentators largely expected Russian music to sound a certain way, and there are historical reasons for that. But so Blome said Rachmaninoff doesn't sound distinctively Russian, and he says he doesn't really sound individual generally. He said that his music is technically effective. No, what he said was that technically Rachmaninoff was gifted but severely limited. Then he said his music is effective, but monotonous in texture. You see, so these are almost contradictory pairs of adjectives, and he says that the music consists, in essence, mainly of gushing tunes accompanied by a variety of figures derived from arpeggios. And then he tacked on a really biting prognosis, which is the unusual, extraordinary popularity some few of Rachmaninoff's works enjoyed in his lifetime is not likely to last, and musicians never regarded it with much favor. You see, that is a sweeping claim. The fact, to say, think what you will of Rachmaninoff's music. For someone in an authoritative context to come out and say musicians never regarded it with much favor is an absolutely sweeping generalization. And so in their responses to Blome's assessment, different critics they've honed in on one or other of these points that Blome mentioned, and then usually fleshing that out in a way that reflects their own experience with Rachmaninoff's music. So some would hone in on the fact that Rachmaninoff was popular and would posit that it was this popularity that was somehow resented by music critics. Others would focus on the old-fashioned aspect and say, well, Rachmaninoff, because he was still composing in an expressive style when music had really become quite a bit more modern, in the first half of the 20th century, that's why critics didn't like it. And others would say, well, it's because he was such a good pianist and a good composer, and people resent the fact that he could do both of those well, So basically, there's a lot of speculation. And my dissertation, which focuses exclusively on his reception, is the first extended study of that subject. There's been a lot of comment on it, but it's usually like an introduction to a book, an introduction to an article, a passing comment here or there. And so there's just a lot of confusion. And so looking at a wide variety of musical documents, I've been able to determine precisely why, musical commentator X did not like Rachmaninoff's music, and whether or not that reflects any sort of general trend in a given geographical region at a given time period. And this is exactly the type of clarification, or I should say elucidation, that I at least feel his reception really begs for, because we're dealing with a figure who, from the beginning of the 20th century up until, and increasing until this day, has occupied a very prominent position in the standard repertoire. And the state of the understanding of his reception is still ambiguous. So it's been fascinating for me to get inside that. Some people, as I mentioned, there was this. I guess I've already kind of mentioned all of these basic criticisms of Rachmaninoff's music. There were the modernists, and the basic tenet of stylistic modernism of the early to mid. Maybe even, basically from about you could say the premiere of Rite of Spring, for example, because that was so prominent in 1913, all the way until maybe the mid-1970s when modernism finally started to capitulate, was, the basic tenet was you have to, the element of innovation that was valued was novelty in style and harmony, usually incorporating a greater amount of dissonance into the music, or challenging any number of the aesthetic norms that had governed music in the 19th century or even the late 18th century. And so yeah, there is that element. Rachmaninoff, continued to compose in an expressive traditional idiom after many prominent composers, especially Stravinsky, had basically jettisoned that and were exploring new paths. But there's also a historical curiosity that explains this, and that is that Rachmaninoff, although he was widely viewed as being a traditional conservative, or by critics old-fashioned composer, say from 1920 to 1943 when he died, that opinion was based pretty much exclusively on music that he had written before 1910, when modernism had not yet achieved its preeminent status. And so but what was happening is that music that had been composed then was now coming into its full maturity in the repertoire in the 20s and 30s. And so people strongly identified him with those works, when actually the works he was composing at that time evince subtle changes of style that arguably do reflect a more modern standpoint, not in harmonic style, but in philosophical outlook. So that's the modern element. Then the Russian one I already mentioned. I can give you a little background there if you want. Basically, the Russian school, as far as it was perceived in the broader Western world, was exclusively identified and actually I have to make a distinction here, because in the repertoire, the first Russian composer that many people came to know was Tchaikovsky, or slightly before him, Tchaikovsky's teacher, Anton Rubinstein. That was how many concertgoers got to know Russian music. But at the same time that their music was entering the international arena, there were the group of so-called nationalists, usually known as the Five. We're talking about Mussorgsky, Balakirev, Borodin, Rimsky-Korsakov, and César Cui. they through their mouthpiece, who was the very influential Russian critic Vladimir Stasov, were portraying their own music as the only authentic Russian music. And they had very kind of unsavory racial undertones in this, which has been the subject of various recent researches by Richard Teruskin and Marina Filova-Walker. But anyway, they propagated a view of Russian music in print that contrasted distinctly with what people knew in the repertoire. And so no sooner had Tchaikovsky's music, for example, come into renown than the official musical commentators, the specialists of Russian music, were saying, oh, that's not authentically Russian, because they were reading the writings of these nationalists. Those nationalists, Cesar Cui and Vladimir Stasov, were considered these initial specialists of Russian music. And so they had a partisan interest in those perceptions. So Rachmaninoff suffered from that. In places where that vision of Russian nationalism was embraced heartily, the reputation of people like Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff suffered the most, and that would be France and England. Not as strongly by any means in America, and not either in Germany to the same extent. So that's kind of the national picture. That all got deconstructed in the 90s. And so that really has officially fallen by the wayside by this point, as has the modernistic critique. And you really can really measure his reception. I mean, you could theorize that his reception at any given time during the 20th century would result from a combination of any given commentator's views on modernism, on Russian music, and then just their taste in the mainstream classical repertoire, and so now all of these ideologies, they really have just been deconstructed, and so it's returning to the evaluation of Rachmaninoff's music is much more straightforward now than it would have been 50 years ago, for example. So it's an exciting time for I think, Rachmaninoff's reception. Now, of course, I'm not venturing a reevaluation of his music in my research right now. I'm just studying the reception to try to clarify, to try to elucidate the issues. So it's been a very interesting journey for me, at least. I would hope that my research would eventually make its way into print. Not in the form of my dissertation as I'm completing it now, because the goal of my dissertation in its present form is to introduce the whole issue conceptually, and then to offer an introductory study that justifies further research in that area. But that research is ongoing. In fact, I was in Russia last fall gathering a variety of sources relating to his reception, because you see, ultimately what we need to understand is not just what was written about Rachmaninoff and why. At least that's not my only question. I mean, that is a big part of the whole puzzle, because we need to establish what was said by whom, when, where, why, in order to even be able to analyze his reception. But if we wish to know the answers to questions like, how did his music survive in the face of protracted negative criticism, then we have to compare the different aspects of musical life to see how they influenced musical commentary, see what was the standing and what influenced it. Now, to a certain extent, that's going to be musical ideologies. So in other words, there are factors within musical commentary that affected the reception. But there are other considerations. There's scholarship, for example. Can we trace the evolution of scholarship on Rachmaninoff, and how did that interact with his standing in more general music criticism? We can look at how frequently his music was published, performed, and recorded, and try to draw comparisons also between, again, the general critical standing, the scholarly standing, and then his reception in the concert hall. Only when we have a more or less complete picture of his reception in these various areas can we venture judgment about the mechanisms that preserved his music and the mechanisms that have been and are currently increasing his critical standing in musical life. So now I've been gathering lots of data on this subject. It's not all going into the dissertation, but I do hope ultimately to complete that more synthetic study, and I would very much love to see that end up in print. I think it would. I think it would represent a major contribution to the Rachmaninoff literature. Concerning my preference of instrument, I'll state plainly that my favorite piano in the world is the New York Steinway, and that has nothing to do with chauvinism on my part. Many people prefer Hamburg Steinway, and obviously in Europe, there are obviously economic and geographic reasons for that too. But Hamburg Steinway is an exceptional piano. I just prefer the range of timbres that can be achieved on a New York Steinway. Now the hammers have to be voiced a little bit more carefully. I think they're a little bit more temperamental because of the way they're made. They end up a little bit softer than your average piano hammer, and that is not not all technicians want to deal with that. But when it's done well, I think it's difficult to argue with the results, and the evidence of that is just listen to the sound of Van Cliburn's piano, for example, which is a fine New York Steinway, or any number of them. So that's not to say that I am snobbish about what I will and will not play on. I'll play on anything, because the point's the music. The piano is a vehicle, but my own personal preference is for that. If I'm given a choice, I'm going to go with a good New York Steinway. And that's what we have at home. And there's an interesting, at least a mildly interesting story behind our piano. We had, when we decided to move down to LA, that's when we bought our first piano, and we initially bought an old Steinway. It was, like 100 years old, but good. That's one of the things that's one of the reasons people buy Steinways, is because they do last if they're maintained. But it was old. It needed work, but it was what we could afford. And so not much. Within a year of moving down there, through a really unexpected chain of events, I stumbled onto this piano that was made in 1967, which in my opinion is a good decade for Steinway. That I've heard a lot of pianos from that decade that I like quite a bit. And the owner was selling this piano for a very reasonable price. And she was an alumna of USC, which we had a connection there because I was at that moment going to USC, and so we managed to get into a very good piano, for a price that in our stage of life was still a stretch, but possible. The piano had been bought by this individual's mother, who was a pianist, but it was bought in that person's old age, and they passed away, and then the piano just kind of sat in the living room for a few years and then went into storage. So by the time I got it, it had been played for maybe a total of 10 years and then stored for the rest. And so it was there was obviously there's certain aspects of it that needed work, but in a lot of ways it was just it was an excellent piano. Students should understand that your choice of instrument as a pianist, as any musician, is an important one, and it is an investment. Now, if you choose to buy a fine instrument, then your money is well invested. It's not going to. As a general form of investment, I don't know what kind of return you'd get on it, but Steinway claims, and I think on a pretty firm documented basis, that their instruments do not depreciate. So you'll never lose the money that you put into a Steinway, for example, and that would certainly be true of any of the finer orchestral musical instruments as well. So you invest in it, and you invest in it because tone, the quality of the tone that your instrument produces, is your form of communication with your audience, and so you don't compromise on that if you value that. And the tone is, to someone that works this, that to a musician, this is it acquires a spiritual significance, you know? I mean, that's just all there is to it. The point is, you need an instrument that is capable of expressing the many fine nuances of the human spirit and of the human experience, you know, which ranges the whole range from terror to ecstasy, you know, and so you have to have one that can do that, and not all instruments can do that. It's just as simple as that, you know. Now, so to put it into a little perspective, you know, basically we got a used 7-foot Steinway. It's a Model B, you know, very popular for homes, you know, and a fine instrument to practice on, for, as I say, $20,000, you know. And I don't know, I honestly don't know what those go for. You could easily check on Steinway's website, but it's not less than $75,000, and it quite possibly could be more. You know, the value, or the cost at least, rises steadily. So you're looking at a big investment, you know. So, I mean, you know, I suppose there is irony in the fact that, you know, the class of citizens, you know, that need these pianos the most for their art are not necessarily the ones that make the best living. You know, because you have to be, I mean, if you want to make, first of all, I'll just say, if you want to go into a money-making profession, don't go into music. You don't go into music to make money. You go into music because you love it, and quite frankly, because you can't live without it. And I'm not saying you can't make a living in music, you know, but I mean, you certainly can in a number of ways that are immensely satisfying. But you know, the only people that really make a lot of money in music are, I mean, we're talking about a very, very small percentage of performers who are playing with in the most prestigious venues. I should say only in the most prestigious venues and only with the most prestigious orchestras. So that's not a very large number of people. It's a very small number. So, but, you know, heaven forbid, you know, our musical experience as people, as listeners, and also as musicians should be restricted to that one context of the great concert hall. You know, I mean, obviously, I love a good concert as much as anyone. You know, and I've loved going to the concerts of the LA Phil while we've lived in Los Angeles. But that's, of all the music making that makes up a person's individual musical experience, it's a small percentage. And we ought to be able to celebrate the music making that is happening in the local college, in the high school, you know, in the church auditorium, you know. I mean, those experiences are significant for people, you know. And so, anyway, I guess I'm saying that because I would encourage young people who are considering a profession into music to consider it seriously. That when a person chooses to go into music, whether as an educator, as a performer, or quite often both, they're making an invaluable contribution to music. Not just to music, but to culture. I was going to say to musical culture, but to people, you know. I dare say that, you know, the spiritual, what I consider the spiritual nourishment and refreshment that comes from listening to high quality music satisfies a human need almost as basic as health.